Hey folks, we're back. We're here to to pick up where we left off and talk about that unfortunate club that we've mentioned a couple times this year already. I think the first time we mentioned it was when we were talking about the Blues and Robert Johnson, who passed away under, so I'm not sure if mysterious is the right word, but definitely kind of suspicious circumstances, I guess we can say. Um, and he is considered by many to be the first member of the 27 Club. Oh my goodness, excuse me. Anywho, so there, this is the Joseph is she's always laughing at me when I do these things, guys. I apologize. But we're going to talk about we're going to highlight three in particular members of this club, the very exclusive club that you do not want to join. The 27 Club is a group of artists. This is if you don't remember. It's a group of artists who died tragically at the age of 27. This goes all the way back to Robert Johnson, and I'm pretty sure the most recent member of the 27 Club would be Amy Winehouse, who died sometime in the mid 2000s. Like I don't really remember exactly. 2006, somewhere around there. And but what also differentiates this group from maybe others who pass away at that same age, it's tragic no matter who it is, but what's different about this group is that they are considered by many people to be some of the most talented minds, some of the most talented artists, some of the most kind of foundational um, songwriters and musicians, people that really stand out when it comes to creating and art and music and things like that. So even though they lived only a short time, they had a tremendous impact in their field. This includes people like Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, who we're going to talk about today, Jimi Hendrix, who we're also going to talk about today, Jim Morrison, who we're also going to talk about today. Also, very famously, as I just said, Amy Winehouse and Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, who we will talk about in a future lesson. Nirvana is a band from the 90s. They're one of the bands that I grew up listening to. And I see some of you guys wearing the Nirvana shirts, but we'll learn about who they are, actually. It's more than just a nice t-shirt. Anywho, let's move on. Let's talk about Jim Morrison and the Doors. Now, the name of the band is just the Doors. Jim Morrison was the front man, the lead singer. And kind of we talked yesterday about Bob Dylan being a poet of rock and roll. Well, I think you can also say the same thing for Jim Morrison. He's a poet in a different way. He's more of a Jim Morrison, I would say, is more of a poet in the beatnik tradition. Okay, maybe a little bit more experimental. But let's talk about the man. So this is the cover of the Doors' self-titled debut album, and if you see this guy here who's got his head tilted, that is the Lizard Man himself, Mr. Mojo Rising, Jim Morrison. So he lived from 1943 until 1971, and he formed the Doors in 1966 with guitarist Robbie Krieger, who's still out there performing. I think I saw in Bergenpack last year he played a show, so he's probably doing all old Doors songs and stuff. The drummer, John Densmore, and keyboardist Ray Manzarek, who also tragically passed away, although not at the age of 27. He died just a couple years ago. So this group is what made up the Doors. They came out with their debut album in 1967, and this is the album that has like so many of their most well-known songs, including "Come On Baby, Light My Fire" and "Break On Through to the Other Side." Doesn't sound as good as when I do it, but I'll link both songs below and you could take a look. Check out "Light My Fire" because I'm gonna post the album version. There's kind of like two versions of the song that were floating around in the 60s and 70s. There is the album version, and then there was the radio version. Now, there's not really any editing that needed to be done content-wise for the song. I mean, there was some actually because in this song he says one of the lines of the song is "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," which many took to be a not so veiled drug reference. So remember, back in those days, the decency laws were much more strict, or I guess I should say they enforced the decency laws. And so that was enough to get that song edited. But the main reason why they edited it for radio was not so much because of lyrics, but it was because of the length of the song. The song is about 10 minutes long, and that was too long for radio airplay because they got to get their advertisements in there and stuff. So but I'm gonna post so they would cut it down lengthwise. Basically they would edit the Ray Manzarek's keyboard solo. It took a very extended keyboard solo, but I'm gonna put the full album version of the song on there for you to listen to. And "Break On Through" is another great one. And this song peaked at number 2 in 1967, got as high as number 2. The only album that beat the Doors' debut album on the Billboard charts was a little album, just a little tiny album called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. So you're doing pretty good. If it's your first ever album and the only band that's beating you is one of the most legendary bands of all time with one of their most legendary albums of all time. So you're doing pretty good. Another funny story about the song "Light My Fire." I would post the clip here, but it has some naughty words in it, so I'm not going to. But this was a movie. There's a movie based on this where starring Val Kilmer playing the role of Jim Morrison in this movie version about the Doors. And they kind of document this when the Doors went on the Ed Sullivan Show. There's that name again. Remember Ed Sullivan? Well, the Doors went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and Ed Sullivan kind of told them that they couldn't say "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." That was not suitable for television. And so they gave him like an alternate. I think it was the alternate lyric that they gave him was "Girl, we couldn't get much better," or something like that. But anyway, Jim Morrison agreed to change the lyric in their live performance, but then kind of reneged and sang the bad words instead. So, and in the movie scene, they kind of showed like the producers and stuff are like, they're backstage and they're freaking out and in the control room, whatever, like, "Oh, go to commercial," like that type of thing. So it's kind of funny. But maybe I'll post the not the movie version that has the bad words, but maybe I'll post the actual Doors clip from the Ed Sullivan Show as well, so you guys can check that out. And just you can know in your mind that people were freaking out backstage as you watch it. Some other hit songs that they had from different albums or songs like Hello, I Love You, Won't You Tell Me Your Name from 1968 and Riders on the Storm from 1971. Okay. I kind of dig the Doors. You know, it's Jim Morrison, just to say a couple more words about him. In a lot of ways, he is very much like the hippies that we talked about in our last class, but with a much more with a much darker ethos about him. He's a much darker character. He's very he's one of those guys where he's like very spiritual, but also very dark. And this is particularly true in a song that was featured on the soundtrack for one of my favorite movies, a movie that's probably too highly rated for you to see. I mean, like probably R-rated. It's called Apocalypse Now. It's a movie about the Vietnam War, and one of their songs called "The End" was on that soundtrack. And this gets a very you hear the kind of sitar, that kind of that Eastern sound, uh, and then you hear these very very dark poetry coming from Jim Morrison. So maybe I'll post that one too. This is the end, my only friend, the end. Creepy stuff. Morrison, if it wasn't creepy enough, he died in Paris on July 3rd, 1971, cause unknown. Creepy, huh? Yeah. No official cause of death. Some people, if you want to get into the conspiracy theories, some people even say he might not be dead. He's hiding somewhere as a part of like a big performance arts piece. But back when you were allowed to go places, you could actually go to Paris, go to the cemetery that they have there, and go to his grave, which is kind of like a pilgrimage site for a lot of fans of the Doors. And if you were to go see his grave, you would see it adorned with many, many bouquets of flowers, which is, which you might expect to see at a cemetery, but you would also see it adorned with various uh, cases of cigarettes and bottles of beer as well, because it is rock and roll after all. All right, let's get into, whoa, something. Okay, there he is. Whew, got scared for a second. Do you know who that is, ladies and gentlemen? Who is this man? Why is his shirt so colorful? Why are his pants so tight? Why is he playing guitar with his left hand? I will explain all of those things and more. This is Jimi Hendrix. He lived from 1942 until 1970. By my calculations, that means he was 27 years old. Born in Seattle, Washington. I think a lot of people have this feeling about Jimi Hendrix because he lived and worked in the UK for so long that he's British, but he's a good old American boy. Strongly influenced by the blues. As a matter of fact, I'm just remembering this now. I apologize. I'm gonna see if I can find this clip of B.B. King and Buddy Guy talking about meeting Jimi Hendrix and how he was such a big fan of both of them and he just wanted to talk to them both so much about the blues. So it's pretty interesting. He's known as being one of the great rock and roll guitarists, but highly blues influenced. That's not so strange, actually. You would expect that, perhaps. He served in the U.S. Army, 101st Airborne Division, and he did that from 1961 to 1964. So, I mean, think about all that's going on in rock and roll during those years. You have, the Beach Boys are going, 1964, that's when you get the Beatles. Beatles formed in 1961. So while all that's going on in the world of rock and roll, Jimi Hendrix is in the Army. He toured with Little Richard, who we talked about a lot. And then in 1966, he formed his band, which was called the Jimi Hendrix Experience in England, okay, as I mentioned before. 1967, you had songs like Hey Joe and Purple Haze reach the top of the UK charts, and it wasn't long before these songs were reaching the top of the US charts as well. He's known as a very virtuosic guitar player, and if you remember, we've talked about this. What does the word virtuosic mean? It means one who plays like a virtuoso. And what is a virtuoso? Virtuoso is someone who is an absolute beast on their instrument. They're a master at their instrument. Okay, so his playing is very virtuosic, meaning that it's extremely technically difficult. Not just anyone can pick up the guitar and play like Jimi Hendrix. It will take you years and years of practice to get to his level. Thousands and thousands of hours of practice to get to his level. All right, let's talk about Electric Ladyland. There's Hendrix on stage at Woodstock in 1969. We mentioned Woodstock briefly, but you know, we understand that it is a major music festival that was really meant to only happen one time. It did happen 2 other times. It happened once in 1994, again, the Woodstock Festival, and then it happened most recently to little acclaim. I didn't really hear much about it, but it happened last summer in 2019 because it was the 50th anniversary. So they did one for the 50th anniversary. The only person who performed at the 1969 Woodstock, who also performed in the 2019 Woodstock, was a man by the name of Carlos Santana. He performed at both, which is pretty cool to have that connection, that 50-year connection for Santana there. But Hendrix famously performed at Woodstock, and what he's most well known for playing there is he opened up the whole festival with his famous rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, which I will post below for you as well. A little controversial, the version of the Star Spangled Banner, I got to admit. Remember, this is 1969. We're in the middle of the Vietnam War, and as we've mentioned several times in this class, the Vietnam War was a very unpopular war here at home. Okay, so there were lots of protests about it, and you know, to be playing the national anthem in the style that he was in 1969 amongst all this anti-war sentiment was, you know, it raised some eyebrows, we'll say that. Okay, so what about his debut? He debuted in the US at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. And he also, believe it or not, toured with the Monkees. Hey, hey, we're the Monkees. And people say we monkey around. Now, the reason why I say believe it or not is because, you know, Hendrix is he's considered to be this all-time great. The Monkees were a band that was created for TV. They were not really a real band in the sense that, you know, they did not form organically. You know, they were put together to be on a TV show that was about a British invasion type band called the Monkees, right? But they had a following, so they also went on tour. And Jimi Hendrix, this, you know, all-time great, toured with the Monkees, which are kind of, you know, this made-up band, kind of funny. So this is a quote about Hendrix. It says, "Using hammered strings, carefully controlled feedback, and unorthodox chordings, he created a roaring, furious guitar style." And he also played the guitar left-handed. The famous story about Hendrix, which is almost a story of legend by this point, is that as a boy, he was too poor to uh, afford a guitar. So what ended up happening was that he kind of um, stumbled upon a guitar, kind of like someone was getting rid of, and but you know, most guitars are going to be made for right-handed players, and so he couldn't afford. He was left-handed and couldn't afford his own left-handed guitar, so he played the guitar backwards and rearranged the strings on the guitar so that it would be like playing, you know, a left-handed guitar. Which is, when that's how you have to learn, I mean, obviously you're going to be pretty great because you're making it so difficult for yourself in the beginning that once you finally master it, you're going to be like levels above everyone else. As I mentioned before, he had top billing at Woodstock and performed a huge and explosive wink wink version of the Star Spangled Banner. When you hear the version, you'll understand why I winked just at you there, because it is quite explosive. He left the Experience to form a group called the Band of Gypsys in the 1970s, and he died following complications of an overdose to sleeping pills on September 18th, 1970. He was only 27 years old. Very, very sad. Very sad indeed. Okay. All right. Well, I feel like I had a picture of Janis up here, but it's, oh well. Sorry about that, guys. We're working through the technicality still. Okay, let's just talk about Janis Joplin here quickly, because I see we're almost out of time. Janis Joplin was born and lived from 1943 to 1970. She's really the first female breakout star in rock and roll. It's not to say there weren't others, or that um, you know, there were many, let's say like in R&B back in those like early rock and roll R&B days, but as far as like super just like stand on her own extraordinary female performers, Janis Joplin is really the first. So this is why she's nicknamed the First Lady of Rock and Roll. Her first band was called Big Brother and the Holding Company, and this is where she gets some of her early songs are with them. But then she went solo shortly after because she always was clashing with the band due to creative differences, but also because of her excessive alcohol and drug issues, which would be the cause of her early death at the age of 27. So I'm going to link below her two most famous songs, which are by far, I would say, no question, Mama, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? And come on, take another little piece of my heart now, baby. You'll love those songs. I certainly do. And that will do it for today. So I hope we know a little bit more about the 27 Club and three of the major artists of the late 60s and early 70s. We are now primed to take on what some consider to be the greatest era of rock and roll, which is the 1970s. That's a lot of people's opinions. I won't tell you if it's mine. But we're going to hit some of these major arena rock bands, some of the prog rock, the progressive rock. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we'll even get into the punk rock. The 1970s were a big decade for rock and roll, and you will see why. All right, folks, submit your notes. If there's any questions, please let me know. Remember, our office hours are live on Google Meets every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. And that's all I got to say about that. See you next time.